Welcome to the Word for Life podcast, a daily devotional covering the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation.
In Exodus chapter 1, we read how Abraham's children became so numerous that even the Pharaoh took notice. You see, only 70 Hebrews migrated to Egypt during Joseph's time. They lived in a place called Goshen, far away from the center of Egypt. They were a small group of people and were unknown. Now they were everywhere. Look at verse 7. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. So, seeing this, the king feared that they might join his enemies and just leave the country. Look at verse 10. The Pharaoh said, "Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So, how can the Pharaoh stop the Hebrews from joining the enemy and leaving the country? For this, Pharaoh came up with a shrewd plan. He started two huge city building projects, two cities called Pithom and Ramesses, which he wanted to be two store cities. And then the Pharaoh targeted the Hebrews and somehow made them work for this project. But little later, he took away their freedom, made them slaves, and even put slave masters over them. Now, all the Hebrews were under Pharaoh's control. He had all their names in his register. They cannot escape the land without his knowledge because they have to come for work every day and he will watch them on a CCTV camera every day. But this shrewd Pharaoh faced a problem. The slaves continued to increase exceedingly. That meant Pharaoh needed more slave masters, more registers, more line managers, and also more projects. Just imagine if you only need 50,000 slaves to build your two cities, what will you do if there were already 100,000 slaves? So, this is what happened. Let's look at verse 12. But the more they oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. So, do you see how the shrewd Pharaoh fell into the same net that he laid for the Hebrew people? Now, this shrewd Pharaoh and the scared Egyptians had to come up with a better plan. And they did. They gave these Hebrew slaves difficult work so that they thought these people, these slaves, will get disappointed with life itself. Verse 13 says, "And the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly." So, earlier, the Hebrew slaves were asked to build the store cities. Now, because there are more people, they were also asked to work in the fields. So, what happened then? Did Pharaoh's trick work? Did the slaves get tired and give up on life? No. In fact, the Hebrew population increased even more. There were actually more and more slaves than there was work. But let's pause here and ask this question. How did the Hebrews multiply so much? Friends, that is something even the shrewd Pharaoh did not understand, but he will soon come to know. The answer is there was a God behind this. He had already planned to increase the family of Abraham as the stars of the sky. So simply, God was executing his plan now. You see, back in those days, many children died at childbirth itself because there was lack of medical knowledge and lack of hygiene. That is why people married early during those days and started having babies early on. But in the case of the Hebrew population, it looked like more children born to the Hebrews did not die at childbirth. They miraculously survived. The Hebrew birth ratio was more than the death ratio. How did that happen? The answer is simply God. His plan, His work, His faithfulness. And so the Pharaoh now feared that the Hebrew migrant slaves will probably one day outnumber the Egyptian locals. So, as his next plan, the Pharaoh commanded the midwives to kill boy babies at birth. You see, the midwives had no choice. It was the order of the king, and they cannot disobey. But strangely, they disobeyed. They let the boys live and also the girls live. And therefore, the population of the Hebrews simply grew day by day. The Pharaoh questioned the midwives, and they told him that Hebrew women gave birth before they reached their houses. Perhaps there was some truth in it. How can two midwives be enough for such a huge population? But we can also accept that they truly disobeyed the Pharaoh and misinformed him. And because the midwives feared God, God blessed the midwives with the families of their own, probably meaning gave them children as well. In frustration, the Pharaoh came up with a final solution. He commanded the Hebrews to throw their own babies in the river Nile if it was a boy. Friends, every time God is at work, the enemy is at work. You might have felt this in your own personal life. When God begins to execute His plan in your life, the enemy will try all his best to destroy God's plan. And for sure, the enemy, much like the Pharaoh in the story, will have some initial success. You see, probably few Hebrew babies were indeed thrown into the Nile. So sometimes God's people will sometimes face the power of the enemy. So sometimes God's people may fail. There could be some disappointments. Some people will leave the faith. Even some leaders might fall. It might look like the enemy is winning. But God, who plans and executes His plan, will always, always have the last word.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow for the next episode of the Word for Life podcast.